I guess if this happens, I think you do also have the option to turn the closed captioning on so you can actually see the text on the video if you need to. Okay. All right. Actually, we'll come back to this. One thing I noticed, we are going to want at the end of class today, we're going to want to use the browser on our Android emulator. And of course, they've made some changes to the AVD. And if you open up the browser on your emulator, it actually has no internet connectivity. So this took a little while to sort out. I think I've sorted this out. So actually, maybe we'll try this to start and just see, because we may need to change our emulators. So if you can open up Android Studio, it doesn't really matter what project you have open. Once you open it up, go to Tools and your Android Virtual Device Manager. So it will open up this screen. Once you have your AVD open, if you just want to press the green play arrow beside your preferred emulator, we're not actually launching an app. We're just going to run the emulator, and we're going to try Chrome and see whether your whether your device has internet connectivity. If not, there's a few potential fixes, and I've put a link up on Blackboard for you. I've tried a few different things this morning, and eventually I managed to get it to work. So run your emulator. I'll just run mine. And from the home screen, the Chrome icon should be on the home screen. So just open up Chrome. The first thing it will ask you is if you want to send usage data to Google. You can uncheck that one. It'll then prompt you if you want to sign in with a Google account. You don't need to do that. And then you'll either get a connection error or you'll get some links to like Amazon, Facebook, etc. If you get that, just try one of them and see whether the page actually loads. And maybe give me some indication that yes, your browser is working, or no, yours is not. Mine was not working when I tried it. Yes? Okay, all right, that's fine, I can wait. While we're waiting, there's a few things to try if this doesn't work. In AVD, over here, if you click the drop down, the first thing to try is the third option, which is cold boot, meaning don't restore the emulator to the last state, basically reboot the emulator. That's one thing to try. That didn't work for me. The second thing to try is the wipe data, because when you run the emulator, any apps we've run on it before, they show up in there. So wipe data is basically like almost like a re-imaging of that emulator. So anything we've done on it previously gets wiped from memory. For some users, that's restored their internet connectivity. None of these worked for me. I actually had to go into my Wi-Fi adapter settings and change the DNS. So I had to actually go into my IPv4 settings. And I've had to manually add those DNS server addresses, which many users said that fixed their problem. It did for me. So if Chrome can load web pages, great. But if not, those are 3 potential fixes you can try. So, and this seems to be a pretty common problem. And it's also a little different. Yeah, and if you're using a Mac, same thing. It wants this 888 as the network. So I've thrown this link up. It's in the bottom of the weekly learning tools and resources folder. So that's here for your reference if suddenly you ever find, hey, my emulator no longer has any internet connectivity. A bunch of those fixes are here. But if you guys didn't have to go through that, well, good. So if you aren't able to connect, use the link, try what's here, try those 3 things. If those things still don't work, let me know, and when we have a minute, I can come and have a look. We don't need that connectivity right now, but we're going to need it later in the class. All right. So this week we want to talk about intents. But I'm going to kind of wrap this in. I had intended to last week. We kind of ran out of time doing our calculator. I also wanted to show you, so I kind of have 2 short slide decks. They're both short, but I wanted to review this because this kind of plays into intents, although intents is about more than just activities. So far, these aren't my slides. They come from Udacity, but I thought there's some pretty good visual representations of some of the things we want to look at doing. I mean, I think by now we know what an activity is, but so far we've only been building single activity applications. Obviously, most apps are going to have more than a single activity. So Android Studio gives us a bunch of templates. Obviously, that first one is always called the main activity. But so some of the templates, so details obviously will be when we get a list and then we're selecting a particular item in that list. We want a separate activity to show more comprehensive view of that one item. There's a template for a settings activity where we're letting users change settings in our app. And there's a bunch of other templates. We may have a chance to look at those either today or next week. So far, we've really only looked at the empty activity. Today, maybe we'll have a chance to see what's in the basic activity, what's similar and how it's different from an empty activity. Okay. So we know that for every activity, right, we get a Java or a Kotlin class, and then we get an XML file down in resource layout. So those are paired. This part's kind of important, and this is going to play into some of the stuff we're going to do with intents. I meant to get to this last week. So here's our life cycle. So what's important to note here is when we load an activity for the first time, it gets on create is called, and then on start gets called. That means if we stop or load another activity, the activity is not destroyed from memory. It's still there. This is why you can use your device's back button and it'll basically go back and load the other activity. Okay. So they're not opened and closed every time like a web page where a browser can only load a single page at a time. The activities are stacked. So this has implications for performance, but it also has implications for things like memory and battery life. Right? If we build an app that has 20 activities and we're letting users navigate around, we have to think about whether we want to just basically pause and hide these activities or whether we actually want to stop and restart them. Which is going to be faster, to hide or to destroy an activity? Yeah, hiding is going to be faster for the user to navigate. Which one is going to use more resources on the device? Yeah, hiding it is also because it's still active. It's still actually there. So there isn't a right and a wrong, but this is something we need to kind of consider when we're structuring our activities and how we're going to let users navigate through our app. Because probably one of the big kisses of death there's 2 and it's a balance. One is an app that users say, well, it's too slow. cool app, but it takes forever, right? I'm going to go find something else. At the same time, another kiss of death is great app, kills my battery. I want to use it, but every time I use it, kills my battery. I'm going to go find something, try and find an alternative. Okay? So this is kind of a constant balance between performance and memory. So we've basically got 4 states. So an activity is resumed when it's in the background and but the user can interact with it. So it's still in effect running. Paused means there's another activity in the foreground, but you can still see the other one in the background. So it may be like a pop-up activity or a dialogue. We've got a pause one in the back. As soon as the user interacts with that modal dialogue, our activity gets resumed. Stopped means it's completely hidden and invisible. It's in the background. So an activity, we then navigate to another one. That first activity is still there in the background, but it's stopped. And then destroyed is when it's actually released from memory. So if we want to open it again, it's got to go through the whole onCreate process. So those are our kind of the 4 states that an activity might be in. So this sort of describes what each of these does: create, pause, resume, stop, and destroy. So these slides are in the lesson 3 folder, and you may want to refer to them as you're building out your assignment, particularly this one, when we're sort of deciding what do we do with an activity when we want to navigate somewhere else. Should we destroy it? Should we just pause it? What's the likelihood somebody's going to want to or need to come back here? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If our app is some kind of procedural step, well, maybe once they finish with one activity, we can destroy it because we're not going to allow them to go backwards. We're only going to allow them to go forwards. So we're going to have to think about how can users navigate through. So we also have this notion of a backstack. So let's say here's our main activity. We load our app and activity 1 loads. If we then let the user navigate to activity 2, normally activity 1 is not destroyed. Activity 1 sits in behind, it's paused, stopped. If we then go to a third activity, we now have 2 inactive activities in the back. And at this point, if the user then clicks back, that will destroy activity 3. So not only will it re-enable activity 2, it'll start it. It's not created, but it's restarted. But activity 3 gets destroyed at this point. So there's a couple of ways, basically 2 ways it gets destroyed. Programmatically, we can decide to destroy it. The user clicks finish, we no longer need that activity, call the finish method. That destroys the activity, it frees up that memory space. It's also called automatically when the user clicks back. So that activity is gone from the stack and released from memory if they click back. And then there's a bunch of scenarios where it gets destroyed and then recreated. And the most common one is the user rotating the device. And that's why there's often a bit of a lag, right? It's not necessarily instant. The UI has to adjust, but what's actually happening memory-wise is that activity is destroyed and recreated. And that's just the default behavior of Android OS. Ali? I believe there's a process where, yes, right here. Look, I was looking for the term, the instant state. So the operating system does have an instant state. It's basically a set of key values, so it will persist as you rotate the device. But all of the code behind it, so the object does get destroyed and recreated. So any code that runs on onCreate will run again in the background, but it will remember the values. So it uses this bundle, it's called a bundle instant state. about each view. So it will save the current state of each view, whether a view is, you know, an edit text, it'll know what's in there, but it will repopulate. So there's a bit of processing and performance effect that happens when you rotate your device. But it doesn't wipe it out like hitting refresh in a browser if you've put form values in and haven't submitted them, how they won't persist. It's kind of like, this is actually the way the old version of ASP.NET Web Forms worked before MVC, that it had a bunch of code basically in hidden fields that would remember what to make the forms sticky in effect. So Android will sort of do the same thing. Good question. And we'll try it. Today we'll try and edit text with our emulator. We'll put it in, we'll rotate it, and we should see that whatever text we've entered in persists when we rotate and rotate back. So these slides, if you need to refer to them, especially when you're doing your assignment, they're in the lesson 3 folder. Okay? This was last week, but it pairs pretty well with what we want to talk about this week, which is our intents. So an intent is kind of a generic object. That means we want to send some kind of message. So there's basically 2 things we can do. We've got explicit intents and implicit intents. So explicit intents typically happen within our app. We want to do something within our app, and the most common one is we want to navigate from one activity to another one. We're going to use an explicit intent to do that, where we're going to have to say, and by explicit, we have to say, we're on activity 1, we want to load activity 2. So we're being explicit about exactly what we want to do. Implicit means we want to run some kind of action, but what app should invoke that action is dependent on the operating system and the user's preferences. So for example, we click on, we put in a phone number and we want the user to be able to tap it and make a phone call. Well, on an Android OS, typically they're only going to have one app for making phone calls, which will be the default phone app. So the operating system is going to know when I tap a phone number and say I want to make a call, it's going to invoke the default native phone dialer. But maybe, and we're actually going to try this, and this is why I wanted to see that our internet connectivity was working. Let's say we want to let the user tap on a URL. Why would this kind of intent be implicit? We know what URL we want to load, right? Right, so by default, well, at least a newer version of Android is going to load Chrome. A really old version of Android is going to load, they actually had a separate Google browser that was separate from Chrome, and that was the default. But you can still install your own browser. Like on my Android device, the default browser is Firefox. So if I tap on a link in an email or on another page, it's going to use an implicit intent. So it's going to look at the operating system settings and say, what is the default app that this user has set to open a web page? So in my case, it might be Firefox on my device. So it's implicit, meaning rather than saying exactly what app we're going to use, we're going to let the Android settings determine what app to use for this particular operation. Just like on my device as well for sending email, I think I have 4 different email clients. So when I tap on an email, it's going to use, it may use a different app, depending. It's going to figure out the nature of that email and send it through the right app. So if we don't care which app, if we're going to leave it to Android to determine what app should run our action, then we're going to use an implicit intent. So, for example, we want to take a photo. We may have multiple camera apps. Any one of them should be capable of taking a photo. Whereas an explicit intent is, we have within our app, we've got a list, and we want to tap something, and we want to load a specific activity. going to be explicit. So with explicit, when we call explicit intent, there are two things we've got to provide, and then a couple of optional parameters. One required parameter with explicit, which is we have to provide some kind of URI. What's a URI? Sounds like a fantastic midterm question. What does URI stand for? I'll give you a clue. It's related to a URL. All URLs are URIs, but not all URIs are URLs. So a URL would be a subset or a child of a URI. Right, so it's, and Travis, what does it stand for? It's a uniform resource identifier. Okay. So that resource could be, a URL is one example, right? It's a unique address. It's a unique HTTP address on a web server. So all URLs are one example, but these aren't the only kinds of URIs. So, for example, in an app, navigating from our main activity to a detail activity, that detail activity class, that's a uniform resource identifier within our activity. We can't have two activities that have the same identifier. They all have to have the same different names. So it could be navigating explicitly to another activity within our app. So the name of the new activity, that will be the URI. We can also provide a context and another component. We don't use those a lot. Those are optional parameters. So our code might look something like this. So we have it in our main activity, and we'll actually run this. We're going to have main and detail. We'll put on a next button. So our code, when our next button is clicked, is we're going to create a new intent. We have to provide the context, and then we have to, here's our URI here. So what is the specific resource that we want to invoke, which will be a detail activity. We'll talk about this syntax a bit later. And then we want to call start activity. That actually runs the action. So here we're setting it up, and here we're invoking it. That will actually load and open our next activity. If we want to go back, we can do this programmatically. So if I click back, it's going to close my activity, and the previous activity in the stack will automatically be resumed. And calling finish actually destroys the current activity and releases it from memory. So this slide, same slide we already looked at. So when we start an activity, it winds up on top of the stack, and our earlier activity, it's still here. It's just stopped, but it's still there. So part of the other implication here with the fact that it's still here is that the data is still here as well. So coming back to what you were saying, Ali. So what happens if we have data? We have values in variables. We may have inputs in views. In our first activity, we open another activity. When we click back, those values, both in the views and in the variables, they're still there. So we may have to think about whether we want those to persist. What are the implications if the user goes back? Do we want them to get this form in its previous state, or do we want it to get it in its original state and we need to clear things out, right? It depends how you want your app to work. But the default is all the data is still here along with it. We also have the ability, one way of thinking about this is we can also pass data from along with an intent. So for example, I want to open my detail activity, but this time I want to pass in a URL from my main activity. And we'll do this. So it's got, the intent has a put extra method. It's almost like, this is almost the Android version of a URL parameter, right? We're going to link from one page to another, but when we link to our second page, we want to append on some kind of key value pair. So that would be an HTTP way we would pass a value from one page to another. So with an intent, this put extra, we give it a name and we give it a value. And then this value of URL is automatically available in our next activity. So we can pass data along. And these extras, this is a whole collection. So it can be, we can pass multiple key value pairs. If we have some data, maybe we want a user to fill out some data on our first activity. We want to take them to another activity, but we still want that data. We want to work with it, process it, display it, something like that. On the next, we can use this extra, this extra class. So if we passed along an extra called URL and gave it a value, on our next page, we can read it with intent.extras. That gives us the whole list, much like, for example, the get object would in PHP or the request.queryString object would in ASP.NET. It gives us the entire set of keys and values, and then we can parse out the individual keys this way. Syntax is probably a little different. That's some. We'll come to that. Double exclamation mark. So that's kind of what an explicit intent looks like. This would be an example of an implicit intent. I'm going to click the website link in Google's Map apps, and it will open whatever browser, whatever is the user's default browser. So we're not going to say, we don't have the ability to say, open this link in Firefox only. We just say, open a web browser, and the operating system is going to decide what app to use. We might also use an implicit intent to do something like send an email. Again, all we have to do is tell Android we want to send an email and fill out the parameters we need for the email, and the operating system will decide what app to use for sending. So we're gonna, here we would do an intent with a send action, and we would set up the content, and then we would start the activity, and notice here, we're calling intent.createChooser. So this would actually prompt the user to pick which email app on their device they wanted to send from. So we can either let the operating system decide, or we can even give the user a choice with an implicit intent if we want to allow them to choose. One other important point, we can write all our code to use an implicit intent perfectly, and it will still fail. So one of the things we have to do when we're adding code to run implicit intents in Android is we have to give them permissions. So the permissions are managed through the Android manifest.xml. So you can see what this permission is going to do here. Right here. It's going to want to set, we're asking for permission to send a text. So this is why typically, this is where it comes from. So you know when you install a new app, and in the installation process, we're going to get prompts about, do you allow this app? This app wants permission to access your contacts or send email, etc. That comes from this list in Android manifest.xml. Vlad? Yes. Yeah, and we will do that later. So you can do it because later we'll want to use the camera. So we'll look at that it will ask permissions. So yeah, normally it tells you when you install the app what permissions, but I don't think you grant or deny the permissions until either you run the app for the first time or until you use that, until you trigger the code that runs the intent that needs the permission. Okay, but if we don't put the permissions in, we won't be able to use those features. But yes, we can do it programmatically. We can ask permission. We can also check if permission has already been granted on the device. So we will do that later in the course. There isn't one, but we could look at doing that. We're gonna do one where we open the external browser. We're gonna do it today. So what we'll do, basically what we want to get working when we work with, so first we'll look at how to navigate from one activity to another with an explicit intent. So we'll do that first. And then once we can navigate back and forth, we're gonna go back to our first activity and we'll put in an edit text where the user can put in a URL. And then when they go to the details page, we'll add another button that we'll call an implicit intent and then load that URL in the browser. So it'll be a simple two-activity app where we're using both implicit and explicit intents. That's exactly what I want to do this morning. Okay, so we'll get all that working. Okay, so these slides are in the lesson 4 folder for you guys to reference. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new project for today. So if we have time later, we may also just make a blank project and throw on a bunch of these other styles of activities just so we can see what they look like. But I'll stick with an empty activity again for today, for now. And I'll just keep all of my defaults. I'll just call it Fall 2019 Lesson 4. Make sure my language is Kotlin, and I'll use my empty activity. So first, we'll just start off with a really simple explicit intent, where we want to add a second activity to the app and then just look at how do we navigate from activity 1 to activity 2. So what I'm going to do here, it's okay, it's still building, is I'll click on, no, I guess I need to wait till it's done. Okay, so once it's done, I've got my main activity. If I click on File and New, we haven't worked with this yet, we can come down to the bottom and we've got a new activity option. So I'm going to add a second empty activity. So just through File, New, Activity, Empty, and I'll just call this one Detail Activity. So we should be using Pascal case for this. So each word starts with a capital, no spaces in your activity name. And you'll notice, so that'll be the class name, and because Generate Layout File is checked off, this will create the RES layout, and your XML file will be called activitydetail.xml. We don't need to specify the extension. Notice also there's a checkbox here for launcher activity. I'm going to leave that unchecked. What do you suppose that means? Ali? You got it, that it would be the default activity. So just call it detail activity. If you call it something else, that's okay. So it's going to sync because we've added a new class. And then we'll open up our Android manifest. So you notice in here, both our activities are declared. Here's main and here's detail. What's the difference between the two of them? So details on line 12 and main is this whole block from lines 13 to 19. Why are they different? Rep? You got it, right? Because this node, this launcher is inside of main. So if we look at them just in the XML view for a minute, so our main activity has a hello world. Our detail activity is empty. So if we run this, we should get a hello world message because main activity is the launcher. So we'll run our app. It should load our hello world. So anytime we add a new activity, it automatically gets tracked by that Android manifest file. right, still building. So our detail activity has no intent filter, but our main activity does. It also makes a suggestion here. It says our app is not indexable by Google search. Consider adding at least one activity with an action view filter. So right now it's going to be hard to find our app in the Play Store if we published it. There is an action view filter that it's recommending we add. We'll leave that for right now. Well, it's taking a long time. So here's the documentation to the intent filter. So this tells us what kinds of intents a particular activity can interact with or respond to. So for example, it can have an icon, attribute. It can be given a priority. So if multiple intents are happening simultaneously, we can assign a higher priority to some of those than to others. Okay, so when it loads, our hello world loads because main activity is set as the launcher. So let's try this. What happens if I go and grab that intent filter? And I'll just cut it. So if I take it out of here, notice I can't run the app. It now says there's no default activity. So it can't run the app because it doesn't know how to start. If I want my detail activity to be first, we could move that intent filter in here and rerun the app. And now when our app runs, we should get a blank screen because our detail activity is empty. There's nothing there. The hello world is only in the main activity. If I move it, and my app restarts, I should get a blank screen this time. Which I do. So that main and launcher intent filter, that always has to go on whatever you want your startup activity to be. I'll put it back to main. But for example, you might have a login activity. And that should go first. And you want your main activity to be the activity that opens after a user logs in. So we would need to move that main and launcher intent filter to our login activity. And that way it becomes the startup file. Okay, so let's go over to our main activity. We can get rid of our hello world. And let's just add on a button. So I'll call it button next. I'll set up a resource called next. I'll just set the value of my resource to the word next with a couple of forward arrows. So that'll be the text that appears on my button. And then I'll just add some constraints. I'll constrain it to the top, bottom, start, and end of the parent for now. So it'll appear in the middle of the screen where edit text used to be. Where hello world text used to be. Nice emulator, small enough we can look at the emulator and look at the code at the same time. I guess I can also pop that window closed. That probably helps. So I'll restart. Remember, I've moved my intent filter back to main activity. So instead of loading the empty detail activity, our startup app is our main activity. Okay, so I just get a button in the middle of the screen. Right now, it doesn't do anything. That's okay. We'll fix that in a minute. So we want to add a small event handler. When the button's clicked, we want to use what kind of intent? Implicit or explicit if we want it to go to our next activity? Priyank? Okay, well, let's ask ourselves two questions. So we want to go from this activity to the next activity. Sorry? We're in the same application, so implicit or explicit? Right, explicit. So what information do we need to explicitly provide to make this intent work? What information is it going to need? Yeah, so what is the URI? So what activity are we going to navigate to? So we're going to need our Kotlin X synthetic import. We'll see if I remembered the syntax for that correctly. I think it's right, maybe. So that allows us to automatically binds our views. So we don't have to declare and instantiate them. So we're going to use an explicit intent. We're being explicit. We're pointing to a particular URI here. But it's not being handled by a different app. We're within our current app. So we're going to see an on-click listener. We're going to create a new intent object. So we're creating a new intent. Within, so the context is our app. It's explicit. We're staying within our app. So our context is the application context. We want detail activity. So we have two issues here. One is intent doesn't know what it is, so we're going to need to hit Alt-Enter and make a reference to the intent class. So if I hit Alt-Enter, it imports android.content.intent. So any activity that's going to use an intent, which will probably be most activities we build, are going to have either implicit or explicit intent or both. We're going to need to reference the intent class. Now it's still complaining here. So the syntax here is a bit odd. We need this, and I'll try to explain why. Although we're writing our code in Kotlin, under the hood, Android is still, we still need to provide a class object here. And I can't exactly explain why, but Android looks for the Java implementation of our detail activity class here. I know I need to give you a better explanation than that, and I'll try to flesh it out a bit more. Vlad? Yeah, that's probably, that's part of why. So that creates the intent, and to invoke it, we then just call start activity and pass in our intent. So let's try this and see if our next button works. And if the next button works, I will reward all those uncaffeinated souls with caffeine. A chance for you to purchase your own caffeine. So now I click next. So it loads our detail activity. And if I click back, it loads quite quickly because it's still here in memory and paused. It doesn't have to restart. So navigating within an activity, within an app from one activity to another, it's fairly simple. Create an intent, provide the Java implementation of that other activity's class, and call start activity. Okay, anybody have any questions so far before we take a break? I know we're sort of walking before we can run today. We're not actually doing anything super complicated at all today. Oh. Okay, so I've hit back. So what happens when you click next? Oh, so the back only works the first time, it doesn't work subsequently. I had to click it twice. It's a fair question. What happens if you go back? No, it seems to work on, seems to actually be working on mine. I'm not sure why. Okay, we're going to add here, we're also going to add a back button that will explicitly call finish, which should then close the activity. So we'll do that after. Okay, it's 10 to 9. Let's take a break.